Welcome everyone to today's Good for a Chat. This is a place where we meet people making change in Australian communities and find out what drives them, what moves them, and how they do what they do. I'm Jo Taranto and I'm one of the co-founders of Good for the Hood, a social enterprise consultancy that works with communities at the forefront of some of these pretty epic changes which are facing us. And really, there really is no greater shift in communities at the moment than the transition to renewable energy. And we need to see it happen fast. We need to see it happen quickly. We need to see it happen in the mainstream, and we need to see it happen behind often closed doors in people's homes. So how do we do that? I would like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Wallumattagal today in North Ryde, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may have joined us today, but also recognising the long tradition of care and custodianship that has been part of the Australian way of life for many thousands of years. I'd also like to recognise that we cannot face the issues that we face as communities and humanity without acknowledging the important connection and regenerative nature of the oldest living cultures on Earth. I'd like to also acknowledge that we are still in lockdown, and it is week 13 on the horizon for those of us in Sydney. And if you are like me and finding that you are measuring the weeks like a good tree with their rings by the distance from your regrowth, I feel you. I have to say that this week started off pretty rubbish for me. So if you're not feeling your best, all the more reason to thank you for joining us today. And I hope that the chat we have is inspiring and motivating, or at least maybe a hearty distraction from the family that are probably driving you insane about now. Today we are talking to someone who is helping us navigate the world of net zero for big energy users. We're talking emissions intensive industries, big business, and possibly one of the trickier, and a lot of who've joined us today are from this world. How do we create emissions reduction strategies in communities when we don't have necessarily control over what they're doing? So we're talking about local government areas and how councils particularly can help communities transition to net zero. With me today is Barbara Albert, and she is the co-CEO of Sydney-based consultancy 100% Renewables. And she works alongside the other CEO, Patrick Denvir, who you may have seen speak as well. She's a speaker award-winning author of her book, Energy Unlimited, which is a pretty fabulous way of thinking about renewable energy. She is really passionate about helping business leaders, community organisations and industries tackle a response to climate change. And she really hopes that her initiatives can help drive net profit with zero emissions as well. Barbara works as a preferred supplier with New South Wales and Commonwealth government agencies. She's on several advisory boards. She's got a master's degree in commerce from the university where she studied in Vienna. And she also attended New York University's Stern School of Business. Please welcome today our wonderful guest, Barbara Albert.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Jo. Such a great thing to join you on this chat today, and everyone else, welcome.
Thanks, Barbara. And you're in Hornsby, I believe. You're also week 13-ish.
Not too far from you.
How are you going in this crazy time?
I'm going very well, and talking about Hornsby, I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the Darug people, the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining today's chat, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The lockdown, you said week 13.
Yeah, I know, right?
Never ending.
Are you glad you're in Australia? Because you haven't always lived in Australia. How is lockdown life here, do you think, compared to your home country of Austria?
Yeah, look, I think it seems that we're always a bit behind when it comes to the lockdowns in comparison to Austria. You know, I chat a lot with my family over there, and they've been going through the lockdowns, and I've been saying, yeah, we've got it so good. We've got no cases here, and they were suffering with their lockdowns. But of course, a zero policy isn't possible, and then it happened here, and now we're in lockdown, and they all are very sympathetic in Austria, but it seems that we are just, you know, following behind. But I'm really glad that we're achieving such great vaccination rates, so that's positive. And I'm also grateful that I live in such a green area, because we're bordering the national park, and it's just that really helps. I'm so happy about that, because I can go outside, I can walk the dog, I take the kids for a walk. It's nice and green, and you can be outside. I think that helps as well.
Absolutely. And so when did you first come to Australia? And you have a background in commerce and economics. Has that really been, you know, a driver for you getting involved in the work you are in now? Or has it been somewhat of a journey of discovering it along the way?
Yes, I studied business administration, economics, commerce, which I'm really passionate about. So I'm very passionate about business, and the study actually helps me a lot. Well, it's not directly related to the work in terms of consulting that I perform, but it's hugely helpful. So firstly, I have this passion for business, and I learned all these things in my master's degree, but I can apply to the businesses I'm working with. And I've got this deep belief that it's possible to achieve net zero emissions cost effectively. So I learned a lot about how you run a business, how you ensure that it's all profitable, and I know how important profits are, and from a council's perspective, how to run a council most efficiently and effectively, so to minimize ratepayers' money being spent on stuff that you needn't spend it on. So I'm very well aware of the factors that drive a business, and that's my whole background. That's where I come from. But then, of course, it's overlaid with my deep passion for sustainability. I've always been really passionate about sustainability, but I wasn't able to apply it in my job previously. So I studied business administration and commerce, and then I went to the States. I worked in the States for a bit, and I returned, and I got into this whole career of risk management. And I worked in IT. I became a cryptography expert. I was doing, you know, digital signatures and secure banking for big major financial institutions in Austria. And then I moved to Switzerland, and then I moved to the Netherlands and to the UK. So I've been everywhere. I worked through the dot-com bubble. That all, when it burst, I came to Australia because I was looking for a new adventure. And then I worked as a risk manager here, but then I thought something's missing. Like, I'm not actually doing what I want to be doing, because I feel there's this urgent need to do something about climate change. And while my career was really fulfilling, and it was great and exciting to work in cybersecurity and in risk management, it was fantastic, but my heart wasn't in it. The passion wasn't there, and I felt at that time that climate change is such an important issue, and it's in me, that like this incongruency of values. Here I am working in this risk management and cybersecurity job, but I feel that I must use my brain power to help solve this urgent issue of climate change. So I started reading a lot, and I started reading about climate change. I had my first son in 2008, and I started reading up on the matter, and then I thought, I can't continue in the job that I currently have. I have to do something about it. And then I had my second born in 2009, and I discovered this amazing short course at Swinburne University on carbon accounting. So I did that, and it was eye-opening. I didn't know all these things. I was passionate about climate change and passionate about climate action, passionate about sustainability, but I couldn't pinpoint it to one specific thing. But then when I did the carbon accounting course, everything just started to make sense. And I thought, this is where I have to go into. And then I quit my job and I started my own business it was called Sustainable Business Consulting in 2009, 2 weeks before the birth of my second child. I started the business and I started Sustainable Business Consulting with the clear purpose of wanting to help drive down emissions. And that's how it all started. Like that's the origin story. So 2009, Sustainable Business Consulting, and the focus was always emissions, but it really culminated in terms of renewables and driving towards net zero, which wasn't such a thing back then in 2009. But it really started with our first work for Lismore Council to bring Lismore Council up again. So in 2014, Lismore Council was the first council in Australia to commit to 100% renewables by 2023. And it was this outrageous commitment and such a big and like, why 100% renewables? No one had ever thought about that. And we were so lucky we got the job to deliver the 100% renewables energy plan for Lismore Council. And Paddy and I were working on that together. So I still had my own company back then, but Paddy and I were working together on this project. And we got so excited about the prospect that an organization could go to 100% renewables. So in 2014, it wasn't a thing back then. But we stumbled upon it and we thought, wow, this is great. This is so exciting. And we worked really hard to develop that into a method that we could then deliver to other councils and organizations. We also based, when I wrote the book that you mentioned before.
Yeah. I was just going to say, certainly you say it was such an outrageous commitment in 2009, but it's amazing how many organizations are 100% with 100% renewables now. This is not, and your business, I think, has grown quite significantly within that time, the 100% renewables. Can you tell us what's in the last year, what's happened for working in touch with
significant growth. So we formed the business in 2015 after we did the plan for Lismore, and then we did the plan for Coffs Harbour, because then it just snowballed. So 2014, we only had Lismore Council having committed to 100% renewables, but then Coffs Harbour followed, Tweed, Port Macquarie, and it just spread from the Northern Rivers region into the along the eastern seaboard and down to Victoria. So it just snowballed, and more commitments followed. And Paddy and I were busy developing all these renewable energy plans, and it was fine. We're plodding along, just Paddy and I, delivering all those renewable energy plans and emissions reduction plans, because at that time net zero wasn't a thing, even going back a few years. So we developed all these plans, and then we formed 100% Renewables. So his company and my company, we merged to form 100% Renewables. And the name, of course, was seeing the vision that we have, the vision for all organizations to be powered from renewables and have net zero emissions was a vision. So that was incorporated in the name. And it was 2 people in 2015, probably 2016, but then we had our first 2 people, and then we grew and we grew. I think at the beginning of this year, we were 5. And last week we hired the 11th person, and we're still hiring for 3 more. So hopefully in the next few months, we're hoping to be at least 14, and we're definitely on a growth path. And this is personally really exciting, because it shows that finally businesses and local governments and communities are getting it. They're getting the need that there needs to be action on climate, that there is this need to decarbonize as fast as possible and to not delay action any further. And that's being reflected in the growth of our business. And that's really exciting, because, it needs to happen, and it is happening.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people need to hear that, because we can see what's happening within our own organizations, but to get a flavor of what's happening more broadly, even when we can be frustrated with perhaps inaction elsewhere, it is really nice to hear that this is a strong priority. In your book, you said that it's I know a lot of these concepts are really quite complex, but you said that, there's really 4 steps to going to 100% renewables. Is it, can it be as simple as taking people through the steps and navigating it, or is it sometimes a really tricky proposition?
Okay, so here's the thing. So people think that going to net zero emissions and to 100% renewables, this is super complex, horrible thing that you have to go through, when it's really not. And we take absolute care to make sure that we demystify the whole concept and break it down into sizable chunks that makes it easier for businesses and for council to go and have the courage to make that commitment, because it is cost effective when it's done right. We've done the analysis, it's possible. It needs to be staged. It needs to even to make sure that you have stakeholder engagement and buy-in. But with everything that we have today, it's possible that over time you can move to net zero cost effectively. So thinking about, for instance, energy efficiency. Well, obviously the energy you don't use, you don't have to pay for. So it's, of course, the first fuel, and you should always be energy efficient because it's good for the bottom line. But now with solar having decreased so much in price, it's also cost effective to install solar. And so looking at electricity consumption, because we talked about energy efficiency, we talked about solar, and of course now it's also increasingly getting cost effective to switch the supply. So where we're getting electricity from to renewables, because renewables are now cheaper than new coal-fired power plants, for instance. So as more renewables enter the grid itself is also getting greener. And over time, we definitely like the grid's shifting, but we also need to make sure that we buy renewable energy, because while the grid is decarbonizing, and it's happening fairly rapidly, organizations and even individuals need to act faster and switch the whole supply to renewables. So for instance, I'm at home, I'm purchasing 100% renewable energy. But yeah, originally there's this misconception that it's really hard and horribly complex, when you can break it down to simple things like, this is your carbon footprint, this is what it looks like. Well, you've got electricity consumption, you might have natural gas consumption, you might have fleets, you have waste, you've got emissions in the supply chain from paper consumption or purchasing professional services or whatever it is. And then you work on defining actions that reduce this carbon footprint, or you work on actions that switch your electricity related or energy related emissions to renewables. So there's lots of things you can work on, but initially it just seems like such a complex problem. But if you apply a method to it and you bring stakeholders on board and you do it in chunk-sized opportunities, it can all be broken down. It's certainly achievable, and it's also cost effective when it's done right. So yes, it seems horribly complicated at first, but it's definitely doable, and lots of councils are proving the point that this is indeed the case.
I'm going to get people to put some questions in the chat in preparation for some of those hard-hitting, tough questions. And I know one of them is going to be, what do you do when your organisation is not quite on board or is going to need a fair amount of nudging? So that's always one we get. So I'll get your thoughts on that in a second. But if you've got any questions or you'd like to just tell us where you are and what areas are pressing for in your communities at the moment. But I guess I'm really interested to know why clients come to you, Barbara. What is it always that they're looking for a renewable energy, a plan for transition? Is it that they want a net zero strategy?
Yep. So
typically they're not sure.
Yeah, it depends. It depends where we see some differences, especially like looking at, because we've got lots of councils here. There's lots of differences between metro councils, regional councils, rural councils, and coastal councils. So usually they're at different stages in terms of their thinking and in terms of their residents as well, and whether or not climate change is something that's acceptable or not. But even even for the regional ones, we see that there's a shift happening. So previously, sometimes with regional councils, you couldn't mention the word climate change, but this is certainly changing because people are experiencing the effects of droughts and of floods, and they're recognizing that there is a link. So it's certainly the sentiment is shifting in the community. So typically for the regional councils, they come to us asking for the development of a plan that helps them save money. So it's all about, it's usually an energy master plan, that they call it mostly. So they're after efficiency improvements, they're after solar panels on the roof, and for us to do feasibility assessments of those. So it's mostly focusing on on-site opportunities that help save money. So that's mostly the regional ones. The metro ones are usually very advanced. Some of them are already carbon neutral under the climate active scheme, for instance. So they're fairly advanced. And for them, it's about developing net zero plans that help them achieve net zero in future. So 2030, 2035, 2040, for instance, to help develop net zero plans. So for them, it's mostly about where do we stand and how can we broaden our footprint as well. So typically, well, the metro ones and the coastal ones are now starting to look at a broader carbon footprint. Previously, they were only looking at maybe gas, fleet, electricity. But now they're expanding to what's called scope 3 emissions, which are value chain emissions, which are mostly emissions, embodied emissions in things and goods and services we buy. So they're extending that and then taking that into the starting point and seeing what they can do to reduce not only their electricity consumption and fleet, but to also look at supply chain emissions and how they can reduce that, and developing net zero plans for those. So it's slightly, I don't want to use the word, like it's more like it's a different way of approaching it. So regional more about cost savings, whereas metro coastal more looking at an all-encompassing view of the footprint and working towards a net zero plan. So yeah, that's what we're seeing. So they're coming to us for all sorts of different backgrounds. But in the end, what we are developing is pretty much similar. So where is a business or a council at the moment? What does the carbon footprint look like? What does the energy consumption look like? And then we look at projecting that out into the future. So how are council services going to change? What's the population change? Does council need to provide more services, more street lighting, etc.? Or for a business, how is the business going to grow over time? How's that affecting the footprint? And if that's growing, what's the task then to go to net zero? And so we're working with our organizations, our clients, to help them reduce from the footprint down to a net zero position, while minimizing carbon offset purchases. And as you know, Joy, that's the only way at the moment to go to a net zero position, is to balance the residual carbon footprint that you have with offsets. But yeah, going back to your question, it's super important to get stakeholders on board and to generate that buy-in, because otherwise it's not going to happen. So if you don't involve key organizational stakeholders and bring them along on the journey, the plan will most likely just get a dust somewhere in a drawer.
And I know that that's no one's wish, especially with it something so critical as this. I want to ask how you felt after the IPCC report that came out I kind of came out smack bang, like a punch in the face during lockdown for a lot of people. I was interested because when we chatted this week, it didn't seem to rock you in the same way.
No,
but can you tell us about
lots of other businesses feel the same way. It's not something for people who are dealing with this and are doing like working in climate action. The revelations are not new. We know that we are so far behind and that we have to act now, and that there's this massive need to decarbonize. So it doesn't come as a big surprise when the IPCC report says that it's happening faster and we really need to act now. Well, yes, we know that. But what is good in the recent IPCC report is that they have updated the carbon budgets and have made it clearer that we have 500 billion tons left of carbon that we can emit before we exceed the safe level of 1.5 degrees. But that's so the 500 billion tons, it's just with a 50-50 likelihood. I don't know, it's horrible to think of a 50-50 likelihood. I wouldn't get in a car if I knew that 50-50 I might die. So 50-50
not
is
great
horrible.
odds. No. Yeah. I guess it was interesting to hear that from you, because I think in a way it made me feel a little bit, I think your calmness helped somewhat, because I think you know, like you said, there weren't surprises there really, but and I know that the weight often is felt on people who don't feel that there's action happening, and you're probably at the forefront of the action that is happening as well, which could help with those that sense of momentum. I was really interested in the work you've been doing in Victoria with farmers particularly as well, because often we know that agriculture as an industry you know, plays a huge role in emissions in Australia, but I don't know that we would have all immediately jumped on thinking that, you know, a transition to renewables was exactly, you know, the focus. So can you tell us how you've been working with the farmers?
Oh yeah, okay, so there's this program by the Victorian government, and they support farmers, so for instance, in cropping or dairy farmers or even wineries, to help them be more energy efficient. So they've got a grant underway. Well, the applications have now stopped, but lots and lots of farmers, hundreds of farmers have used the opportunity to access energy audits. So this is what we and other consultancies do for the farmers. We look at their data. You know, farmers have a lot of diesel consumption, for instance, and some electricity consumption, of course, and we help them be more energy efficient in their operations, in their irrigation, for instance, the way they do business. So we calculate business cases to make them operate more efficiently while driving down emissions. So it's so gratifying, because we're looking for opportunities that help the farmers save money while we're decarbonizing their business. And so lots and lots of opportunities there, and there's different opportunities. There are small energy audits and really big energy audits, which are currently challenging because we can't go to the farms. But yeah, so it's helping them save money and access grant money through the Victorian government. So if they can show through the business cases we develop that it's cost efficient to change I don't know, the guys do all that work, like probably irrigation tractors. I'm not familiar with the actual intricacies, but if they can prove that it's efficient to change their milking processes, then the Victorian government matches the funding to upgrade equipment or something along those lines. So it's a great initiative that we're involved in, and it's going across all sectors. And agriculture, yeah, it's hard to transition the agricultural sector to net zero emissions, because there's lots of emissions, of course, coming through agriculture.
And you've recently been working with someone who's on this call, with Emma from Ku-ring-gai Council. Can you tell us a little bit about the other side of the work you've been doing, which is really about helping councils do stakeholder engagement and find out what the community's feeling and what their attitudes to this? So how does that work when you're working with someone like Emma?
Those communities is the next step, right? So in the past years, councils have been focusing a lot on their operations, and they got their own house in order. They know what the carbon footprint is. They know what they have to do to drive down the carbon footprint, and these operational plans are being executed. Of course, the next step for councils, of course, is to look to the community and to help them drive down emissions reduction. So that's a development that has come about in the last few years, that the councils are now looking towards the community. And it's very much the same thing. So what constitutes the carbon footprint of a community? So looking at at emission sources. And I should give a shout out to BZE, who've got this wonderful snapshot tool where you can look up community emissions for your LGA. And then it's about driving down these emissions and how council can help. But of course, with the community, it's a bit outside the immediate control of council. So it's a bit tricky to achieve that. So initially, the first step is always to lead by example and to get the council's own house in order first, but then to reach out to the community. And then it's all about finding out the sentiment of the community. So, for instance, running a survey to get the attitude to climate change, to see whether climate change is already affecting the community or not, whether they believe that action is important or not, whether they believe how important they feel that what council's role is in driving down emissions in the community. And then it's about being able to engage the community, to run events, to run focus group, and with mixture of online and face-to-face, if that's possible, to talk to people and to find out what's working and what not, and what the differences are. For instance, in a metro area, there might be lots of high-rise developments, and in strata, it's so much more difficult to drive down emissions because you don't have as much control over your dwelling as you would in, say, for instance, a freestanding house that you own. So there's differences in terms of the sectors in the community. So it's making sure that you work across all the sectors and across the demographics, and across maybe even groups that don't speak English really, really well, to make sure that you have touch points with them and get their input, so that this can form part of council strategy in terms of reaching out and helping the community, whether it's running more workshops or having more information up on the webpage, or in the case of Ku-ring-gai Council, they have a fantastic program of financial incentives of, for instance, upgrading pool pumps to more energy efficient ones, or home energy assessments. And then these community events are a great way to get feedback from the community, whether this is actually working and what the community wants to see more of. So I have to big shout out to Ku-ring-gai Council for going through this process and for having this amazing engagement program with the community, which is amazing.
And it's no small task. I think most people sort of groan a little bit when they, have to go out for consultation for anything, as much as they know how valuable it is. It is so immense. And I think that's often the challenge, is that how do we make or help people or enable people to adopt and change, things which ultimately are their own decisions and their own choices. But it is really exciting to see how much Australian communities have adopted solar on rooftops. And, we know there's an appetite for this in communities. So I think it is actually a really exciting space to be in. We got a couple of questions, Barbara, and hopefully these are nice and curly so you can get your teeth. I know you like tricky challenges, but Lana from Hornsby is interested in the most common way that councils or businesses that you've worked with have been able to reduce Scope 3 emissions, because you talked about that being
okay. Okay, so Scope 3 emissions, as I said, mostly from purchased goods and services. Of course, there are others. So just very briefly in terms of Scope 3s, there is employee commute, there is business travel as well. There is assets that you might lease and don't own, or there is assets you might lease out. So for instance, aquatic centers that you're leasing out to others. So these are all Scope 3 emissions, but specifically maybe Lana's questions revolves around the question of embodied emissions in goods and services that are being purchased. Lana, can you just confirm that that's the nature of the question? Because if it is, when it comes to reducing those emissions, is so tricky. You can, of course, there's lots of ways you can reduce emissions, thinking of councils specifically, for instance, asphalt and bitumen in that would be great, thank you. Asphalt and bitumen in fixing roads, etc. And you know that you can reduce emissions, you can increase recycled glass content or recycled asphalt. There's all sorts of things you can do, but the question is, can you measure it and actually prove it in your emissions reduction journey? So when you put your footprint together and you look at your embodied emissions in your carbon footprint and you have it in there, it's the easiest method is to translate from expenditure into an associated carbon footprint. But of course, if you just do that, how can you prove emissions reductions? Really super hard. So then you would have to go back to the actual emissions, emissions factors that translate from kilograms of specific input materials to emissions. But then that's so much work to put that together. So to prove the emissions reduction, you have so much work initially to set it all up and to calculate it all and to get your providers to give you the materials and the kilograms. It's super hard. So it's really tricky to do that. But one thing that you can do in terms of embedded emissions in the goods and services you supply, a really quick fix, is to make sure that the input that comes into your council or business is carbon neutral. So you can work with your suppliers and incent, and ask them to perhaps consider carbon neutrality, because what that means is that the supplier looks at their carbon footprint and looks at how they can be more energy efficient, switch to renewables, put solar panels on, etc., and then neutralize their carbon footprint, so that when it comes as an input into your organization, it arrives in a carbon neutral state. And it makes it really easy from your perspective to do the carbon accounting, because you can deduct carbon neutral inputs. So it's just an easier way to do it. And then, of course, one other aspect is that as any organization really has lots and lots of different suppliers. So in a way, you only have capacity to work with a few of them to drive down the carbon footprint, but you can't work with all of them. So there's always a balance that needs to be struck between ease of making sure that you can capture it and show the reduction, as opposed to working specifically with a few of them to reduce and then to show the emissions reduction that way by really working with your suppliers. But yeah, it's more effort and it's a balance.
We'll just tell everyone they have to be climate neutral from now on. That's fine. But it certainly shows the role in procurement that this is going to really transform what we're asking of people in our supply chains. I'm assuming, Barbara, if you start looking at how much easier it is to procure from someone who has neutrality versus someone where you're going to have to spend an awful lot of time carbon accounting. It's quite amazing. I got a couple of quick questions. We are going to try and finish up on time in 5 more minutes. So one of the questions we have from Kimberly is, once you have a baseline for your carbon footprint, what are the next steps you'd recommend in taking to setting a target?
Mm-hmm. So setting it there's lots of ways you can attack the setting of targets. It could be a bottom-up approach. It could be a top-down approach. So initially, when you do your carbon footprint and you look at how you can reduce the carbon footprint most cost effectively, and that's mostly in the short term energy efficiency measures and solar panels on roofs in a nutshell. So if you look at those and you construct bottom-up with feasible measures, and it depends on your councillors on whether they would agree to that. So it might only be, a 20% reduction over a certain time frame, something that's really cost effective and does not cost money in the short term at all, other than the investment, which returns savings back into council. So that's a bottom-up way of constructing targets to see, look at actions that are feasible in the short term and construct it that way. Or it can be a top-down approach where you say, well, we recognize the science, we know that we need to act, and we're going to set a target, for instance, in line with science, which would indicate that the net zero, if it's a net zero goal, so say it's a net zero aspirational target, it shouldn't be further out than perhaps 2040 should be about the max that it should go to, and then to construct a pathway that allows you as a council or business to achieve that. So it's two ways of doing target setting, bottom up or top down, really. And it's all really a question of what's acceptable for councillors, because ultimately they need to adopt the target, and they reflect the opinion of ratepayers. So it's all a question of what's palatable.
We've got our last question, Barbara, is around how we find out and keep on top of opportunities, particularly grant opportunities that might enable reluctant business owners or organizations to maximize, I guess, or minimize the risk financially for them to be involved in something. Is there anywhere that's just really awesome to stay connected with that would help organizations like this?
Yeah, so there's three levels of where grants can be obtained from. Well, sometimes local governments have grants for businesses. There is grants coming from a state level, and then there's grants and incentives coming from the federal level. So to give you examples, like the Victorian government had the support program for the farmers. New South Wales has the support program for people that, like organizations that want to be more sustainable by sustainability advantage, or sustainable councils and communities is another program. We have the white certificate schemes that come from state schemes, such as, for instance, the ESCIs here or the VEET scheme in Victoria. So we have that in terms of states. And then we have the support for solar from Commonwealth in the form of renewable energy certificates when you install solar. So that's the different levels of support. And grants are such an important thing, and especially for councils who are always resource constrained, and grants are such an important way to finance emissions reduction initiatives. But there is no, I don't think there is a single resource that captures all grant opportunities that are out there. It's a matter of staying up to date and checking what grants there are currently in what incentive scheme. But it's such an important part of a financing strategy, because if you look in terms of what an ideal financing strategy looks like for emissions reduction actions, it always starts with free money first. Free money in terms of grant funding, even if it's matched funding, it's the best thing to do, utilizing white certificates schemes from the states or renewable energy certificates from Commonwealth. So it's making sure that these options are harnessed. And then the next best option, of course, for a council, for instance, is to access funds from the capital operational budget, because it's usually better financially to, in most cases, it's better financially to implement, so for instance, solar panels using your own money, because you get the greatest return on your investment. But where this is not possible, you can take a loan, and of course, councils have access to really cheap rates. So that's the next best thing. But where you can't take a loan, then third-party suppliers can take a loan on your behalf. So for instance, you can get on-site solar PPA on your rooftop. So that's that. And then, there's also other options such as energy performance contracts. But grants, yes, it's a great
Don't worry, Paula, you just have to subscribe to about 4 new newsletters, which is what everyone wants. Or, as Julie suggested, you could just subscribe to the 100% Renewables newsletter too, which apparently is awesome from all reports. So, wonderful. And that she will do. Awesome. That's fantastic, Barbara. And I certainly know that you have a lot of amazing content. If, I am buttercup when it comes to learning about some of the things you talk about. And I know every time I watch one of your videos or listen to one of your podcasts, like, it expands my brain that little bit more. So if you are a bit like me and you're feeling like, I know a little bit, but I could really learn a lot more about, different scopes or different strategies or different approaches or carbon accounting or, emissions engineering and all the other amazing things that you do in your work, then yes, definitely check out some of the content that Barbara has, and we'll share around those links shortly. We'll also share this recording, so if there's anyone that you'd like to see it, or if you want to look at some more of the work that Barbara is doing and get in touch, you can certainly do that. It's been fantastic to have you all here. I really am so grateful, because I know what Fridays are like, and it is just, it's a slide into the weekend funk, or slide out, I'm not sure. What even is a weekend? But thank you, Barbara. It's been our absolute pleasure to have you here and to pick your brain for a short period. And I'm really hoping that you can work with some of these other organisations, business leaders and councils to really get these amazing pathways really to decarbonising our communities. So thank you for the work you do. And if anyone's looking for a job, Barbara's got 3 on her website that she needs to fill. So big business. Thanks, Barbara. And thanks everyone for joining us. And we'll see you again soon. Have a happy Friday.
Everyone, thanks for having me. Thanks, Joy.